thank you everyone for turning out on Saturday. Obviously, it being the weekend and stuff, and maybe people having other commitments. It's great to see so many people here. I know a lot of people are super interested and hyped to hear Nikkita explore her process in relation to how she approaches environment art, particularly stylized. So yeah, this evening we're joined by Nikkita Racquel, who is a junior environment artist at League of Geeks, and Nikkita will be speaking and exploring her approach to creating stylized art content, particularly environments, I think, for games. So Nikkita, I'll hand it over to you, and you can take it from there.
Thanks. This is just going to be me chatting for a bit. So the one thing I wanted to do with this is that there's tutorials, like endless tutorials, endless classes, endless stuff about how to teach you how to make things, but this is more a thought process of how to keep in mind style and story more than actually creating stuff, considering that all of you here know how to make stuff, so I'm not going to worry about hashing that over for the 100th time, because you're probably bored of it, which is very fair. So, nothing in this is exclusive at all. This is just suggestions, helpful tidbits, sort of my way of going about things, or like some things that I will think about while I'm creating stuff. Uh, and that is very, very important. There are never any rules, ever. Please take this with a grain of salt, or many salt. So this is just sort of like a general introduction of like how to think about this, because I'm guilty of this too. Whenever we think about stylized, we're normally somewhere down here, and this is still pretty much generally in my frame of mind, unless you are trying to recreate something that is real, like COD, for example, that's real weapons, real gear, real explosives, etc., etc. It's going to be some form of stylized. First, your look. What's the stuff you're gonna make look like? It's generally a good rule of thumb to start with. So, like for example, there's some Borderlands here. It's very dark and moody sort of thing, but it's very campy. It's, I think, very much like 80s sort of style when I think of Borderlands, with a little bit of grit, essentially. We've got Skyrim here, Elden Ring, obviously, TF2. It's lots of different things that you can think of in different ways of how you actually would make things look. Story. And this is where I basically live in my head, because story is the most important, essentially. A solid sense of story makes for a better piece every single time. Not all of the examples here will suit every situation. Some might suit no situations. For any environments, props, characters, I've tried to include a little bit of everything here, even though my specialization is environments. I do a little bit of everything at work. So I've tried to keep in mind the same sort of thought patterns across everything I do. So, setting, pretty obvious. Are we going dark and moody? Are we going something more whimsical? Are we going something sci-fi, desert-like, etc., etc.? Period, medieval, futuristic, modern. Where are we going? Like, that will inform. Like, everything here will inform a lot about what you'll be doing in your modeling, your sculpting, every step of the process. Feeling. Are we going happy, light, very breezy? It's meant to feel like, it's meant to encapsulate you and just make you feel good. Are we going really calm and tranquil? It's very peaceful. It's meant to be just that, essentially. Are we going scary, uneasy, like we're supposed to be walking in with this sort of dread feeling in our stomachs? Use cases and uses. Yeah, just pretend this is an awful attempt at editing real quick. So, same object, same situation, but different use case for framing, colors, mood. You can do a lot with a very little. Age and condition, generally pretty self-explanatory, but the one thing that a lot of people tend to forget, I think, is that just because something is old doesn't mean that it's going to be in grubby condition, essentially. So something can be old, but it can be well taken care of and still work exactly the same. Something can be modern, but if it's rusted or dirty or gunky or whatever, means that someone might not have cared about it and they've just used it for whatever. Place, just where are we, essentially. It's going to inform a lot of possible use cases, possible condition, possible feeling. Like this, all three of these already have some type of mood and feeling that they want to provide. And materials, essentially. Not just what they are, but the version of them that we're seeing. So chipped, rusted, jagged, sparkling clean. Shapes and silhouettes. This is king in stylized work. Your shape and silhouette is going to inform so much of what you do. More applies to the stereotypical view of stylized. So like this image here, this image here. But it does apply to all stylized work. And it is very important to always remember. Forms from a distance, which is also why it's important. In characters, it can make implications of who they are. So considering very angular features on this character here, like hips out, hand on hip, very like strong pose, very confident. Eyes are giving you a certain mood, certain look. And it also helps create separation in depth, especially environments. So this tree here has got a very specific silhouette, helps break it apart from everything that's going on in the background, considering the background is pretty full and there's a lot going on, helps make that juxtaposition. Personality. Attributes of the piece that create uniqueness. This is where all the elements of the story come into play to create the certain personality. Things like color, level of detail, shape and silhouette, size, materiality. Everything will create this certain personality. Yes, this is applicable to props and environments, not just characters. So some quick examples of just sort of real life objects taken into a stylized form. So just simple things basically turned into several different stylized forms. So there's like really stereotypical here. There's I believe that's Elden Ring there. This one's Skyrim, and then something different again. These are examples from my work specifically. So this is 3 different bookcases that I worked on for a project. These are all for the same project. So a little bit of detailing on some picture frames, but I didn't want them to be too detailed, but I didn't want them to be overly simple either. So I more went with very geometric shapes in this to try and give it some sort of life. Very quirky shapes, very off-center. I didn't want anything to have straight lines or be overly uniform. This concept was being used for this one, but not every single thing in it was cat-like. And I was like, well, if we're going to make nearly everything cat, why not just make pretty much everything cat-like? So nearly everything, I'm pretty sure everything except the logs specifically has some sort of cat-like motif or cat shape in it somewhere. Even the smoke, yes, and the butter. These are more examples of the same sort of thing here. So it's taking simple everyday items and giving them a stylized shape or a stylized silhouette, texture. So it's just general like bunch of ceramic stuff, applicable to where we were for this project and the sort of nomadic people that we were trying to encapsulate. So these people were on the go a lot. They didn't have a lot of materials to make stuff out of. So basically, like, this is just like a bunch of metal stuck together. This is just like really, really simple ceramic work. And it's all that these screenshots here don't show it very well, but there's no, like, it's very, it's not very uniform. So there's lots of bends and twists in it, so it's very handmade, and that was the sort of touch that we wanted to have to everything. Live example, because this stuff is never fun if you have not a live example, because presentations can be boring and we don't want that. So taking that mood board here and just mapped out a simple shape here, and we're just going to play around with it. And this is half the fun, is that we're just gonna move stuff out, break the uniformity a bit. Don't worry about topology. This is just how can we differentiate the shape and the silhouette in some sort of way that is more applicable to what we're after. So there were particular things in sort of each of these screenshots that I liked. So there was a sort of layered look that I wanted to go after. So just quickly chuck that up there. And we have like a little on-desk shelf. I really like these chunky drawers that we had that mimicked the outside shape of the desk. So maybe not quite sharp. Yeah, there we go. Doesn't ever have to be ridiculously obvious. Something subtle can always be the way if that's what you're after. Now, if we've got larger forms in, we can always go in with a little bit more geo. Blender, please behave. My word. There we go. And we just start moving stuff around. So we got a bit of jagged here, just something that gives us a more interesting shape to work with. We don't have to do this in polymodeling. You can always do this in sculpting, or you don't have to do this at all. This is just sort of what I keep in my head whenever I'm doing modeling, essentially. So what's the overall look going to be? What type of person would be using this? In what sort of setting would this be? What are the general shapes that I'm looking for? Are they going to suit the rest of the environment, or are they going to be a little bit out there and I need to pull back a little bit? It's all just testing and experimenting. Even just that, a little bit of playing around, it already gives us a little bit of character, a little bit of that personality. And that's what you want to make sure of whenever you're doing stylized work. Handy tidbits, because we all like these. Consider all your axes. Yes, I know this is one that probably all of you are like, yeah, no shit. But it's one thing that most people do forget about, and I do this at work a lot of the time, is that especially when you're working with concepts, you'll be getting them from one angle normally, and you've got to pretty much sort of make it up as you go sometimes. And that's half the time what I have to do. And you'll see it work from one angle, and then you'll turn it, and it won't work. Just make sure that you consider everything as you go. use real and stylized references. Just then, when I had that little mood board, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that I had some sort of real and stylized references, because generally the stylized is what you're going for, and the real is to make sure that your shapes are still recognizable enough that it still looks like what you want it to look like, but has that flair. This is directed at nobody in particular, but I know a couple of XYZ participants have done this before. Please, for the love of God, texturing gods, shift your hues. Light does not work in one spectrum or one color. It will cool when it goes into shadow, and it will go warmer when it's more in light, generally speaking. If you're working with different lighting settings, the colors will work differently, but that is the base to always go back to. Color variation, every time. It's one of the things that I always give as feedback to most stylized work when I see it for texturing is color variation. It's great. It's everywhere. It's amazing. It will brighten up everything. Without color variation, everything looks very flat. And unless that's what you're going for, which is perfectly fine, then color variation all the time, everywhere. Push and pull, everything. Just have a go. There's nothing wrong with trying something, having it not work. It's fine. It will happen all the time. Just go ahead and do it. It's fun. This one is a little bit, it's not necessarily a this is the way to go. None of these are. These are all just suggestions, essentially. This is one thing I do a lot, in particular for my personal work. I won't do it for at work, at my job, but I'll do it for my personal work because I like the look a lot better. Especially in hand-painted work. Colouring your AO will help your colours not come out as muddy, but it can also do a lot of interesting things for PBR. It's just a sort of experimentation thing. This is also one thing that I try to stick to in most of my stylized work is no straight lines. Nothing, basically, unless it's either brand new or it's made by a machine, it will have no straight lines anywhere. And it is very, very obvious when you put stuff into, especially stylized, and you have straight lines, they stick out like a sore thumb. Play with colors in your lighting, because it's fun. You do not need to do everything by temperature. If you have some really twisted and stylized scene, bump it up with some color in that lighting. At least have a go, have a play with it, because it will also make such a difference. Experiment and have fun. Stylize is fun. And you will only discover that if you experiment and play around and don't stick to norms. Do you, and you find it, and it's cool. Thanks, y'all.
That was super interesting, Nikkita. Lots of really interesting and sort of useful insights into different aspects of what makes Stylized sort of unique and stand out for you. There's a few questions. Let me go back to
Sure.
where the questions are. They're in the channel above. Let me see, where do they start? There we go. Question. So, first question is from me. What is it about stylized art that particularly interests you? So, what is the big draw for you? What sort of, why was that the sort of the area of art that you kind of find yourself working in, do you think?
I think it goes back to that spectrum slide I had earlier. Is that stylized, for me at least, in my head, can include nearly anything, and the range you can get within that spectrum is insane. You could have two stylized artists technically doing the same thing, but doing it wildly different ways and wildly different styles within stylized. Even though stylized is technically, in most people's minds, a style, there's so much more to it. There's so many more subcategories within it that can make people stand out. And there are so many ways of doing it. Like, there is no one way to do stylized. There's one very, very correct way of doing hyperrealism or
Mm-hmm.
realistic art,
Yeah.
but there is never one way or even so much a right way to
Yeah.
do stylized.
You see more personality, I guess, with stylized art from the actual person behind it.
Very much so. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Cool. Um, so as I mentioned at the start of the talk, there's definitely a couple of my students that are exploring stylized, and utilizing stylized as their sort of chosen art style for their projects and so on and so forth. Have you any tips that sort of you think are useful to consider to make your art sort of stand out? So, but particularly, I mean, within the stylized domain. So, like within realism, there's accuracy, and your material reads and stuff like that really help sell your understanding of realistic art. Are there kind of things that you think can really help showcase that you've got a good understanding of how stylized art works?
Oh, um,
Tough one.
it is very, very tough. It's, I say this without being, with no malicious intent whatsoever, but
Mm-hmm.
don't do what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely fine to look at artists that you look up to and be like, I want to be like them, or I want to make as good a stuff as they do. There's no problem with that. But don't just repeat what you see everyone else doing because you think it's cool. Like, give it a try for sure, because you'll learn more about the unique way that you work and your unique style within Stylized.
Yeah.
And that's half the fun is, again, like experimenting with Stylized, because there is no one way to do it. And the experimentation is a lot of the fun. Like, I never would have thought for half of my stuff within my personal work that I would have done that if I didn't just play around and throw whatever at the wall and see what sticks.
Okay. So don't be afraid to experiment and sort of like just let your own take on things kind of come out, I guess.
Absolutely. Never be afraid to experiment, never be afraid to have something not work, never be afraid to try anything.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with getting it wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
when you get it right, you'll get it very right and
Mm-hmm.
it will feel awesome.
Cool. Awesome. Is there any advice you would give your younger self looking back now? So obviously you're now like you've been in the industry for a while, and you probably have learned more on the job as well. But like looking back, is there anything that you kind of wished you learned earlier, quicker, focused on more?
um there's nothing I would say for my work wise.
Hmm.
I think just chill out.
Yeah.
Just you keep doing you. And I know that everybody is going to worry about not sticking to any sort of norm. Like,
Hmm.
even within my own portfolio, there's like several pieces that it's like, there's one way of doing something, then there's another way of doing something, and then there's another way of doing something. Like, don't be worried about doing you, because the right company will find you and they will like what you're doing.
Cool. I think that's a really important thing because I do think there's maybe especially among students, you kind of see them all trying to replicate what they see as popular.
Hmm.
And while that can be, of course, useful, I've done it myself to a degree. I think recently there was like on the server alone, there were maybe like 10 different aircons being made and looked at and so on, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. But I think what you're trying to say,
Mm.
which is right, is there's nothing wrong with also experimenting and trying to do your own thing and being
Yep.
unique and sticking with that. Cool, cool, cool. Helena has a question. I think this is a really good question. What would your advice be to someone who is perhaps more used to doing realism, but is interested in trying out stylized?
Start small.
Mm-hmm.
Start small. Stylized, especially to realism artists, can be quite confronting. It can
Mm-hmm.
be quite overwhelming, and that's perfectly reasonable because it is a lot. Again, the whole spectrum thing. There is. so many ways to make stylized art, and that can be very, very overwhelming.
Yeah.
Just start small, take it slow, do some research if you want to. References out the wazoo
Yeah.
will help you a lot, like a lot, a lot. Like you can never have too many references, especially when you are not used to doing something or you're trying something new. Like
Yeah.
just give yourself the best opportunity to be prepared for it,
Hmm.
and you'll be fine. It's the same again. Like, don't be afraid to get it wrong because
Yeah.
you will,
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
Not necessarily stereotypically wrong, but wrong for you, and you're like, I don't like that.
Mm.
That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I
There's
think
nothing wrong with it.
I agree. I think we're very guilty. I think modern society has made people very afraid of failing.
Mm,
There's a stigma, like whereby if you don't get something right or whatever, it's like, oh my God, like, the worst.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's some of the worst in artists, for
Yep.
sure.
Yep.
We are so such passionate, driven, creative people, and we put a lot of heart into what we do.
Yep.
So when someone, either it be ourselves or somebody else, has something to say about it or some sort of feeling towards it,
Yeah.
it can be a lot.
Yep. Yep. Um, just on your process, so this is just out of personal interest for myself more than anything. So you mentioned obviously like the hand painted approach.
Hmm.
Um, is that, do you use that a lot, or is it sort of a case of, a lot of cases just because of the speed, you're more relying on like the more PBR gradient based painter approach? Is it
So
common
this
in
is,
industry? Sorry, is it common?
uh,
Is hand
no, no,
painted
no.
used a lot or not?
So it'll completely depend on the
Mm-hmm.
project in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
For my personal work, I'm a hand painted artist. It's what I love to do.
Okay.
And for like any work that I've got going at the moment outside of my job,
Yeah.
it will be hand painted normally because I don't work in hand painted solely at work.
Okay.
But with the particular style of the project I'm on, it requires we work in PBR, but it requires a hand painted touch.
Mm-hmm.
So it needs to look like it's been made by people and not just materials
Yeah.
with a little bit of adjusting. It needs to, like, there's a lot of work that goes into having a very hand painted or like handmade touch to especially our texture work.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, it's a little bit of a mixed bag with me and with hand painting and PBR at the moment.
Okay, that's fair. Helena has a question which I guess kind of overlaps a little bit with what I asked already, but it's, do you have any advice on developing a style for yourself and make yourself stand out in terms of stylized work? So I guess is that
Poor.
kind of like what I was saying before about tips, but maybe more about just developing your own style. Have you any advice on how to approach that?
Once you figure out some advice, can you let me know? Developing a style for yourself takes so much time. It takes so much time. And I still don't even have one. Like, I know what I like, and I know what, at the end of the day, I know what I want it to look like.
Yeah.
But even, I don't know if I personally, as an artist, will ever have a defined style because the two projects I've got to the go at the moment are already drastically different in the way they're made, the way they will be textured, the way they will be presented and lit, and everything like that. So it's unfortunately a little bit of a question that's a little bit lost on me.
Yeah.
But there's also nothing wrong with not having a defined style either.
Hmm.
Like, I make stylized work.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it at the end of the day,
Hmm.
honestly.
Hmm. Cool. 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 We got two more. So Paulina asks a question about color. So you obviously mentioned playing with colors. I don't know if you've seen, Paulina was working on some rocks for an environment
Yes.
recently. You did
Yes,
say
I
that,
did.
okay. So her question is, for example, if the rock is gray, so if you're obviously painting the rock gray, when you say play with color, do you mean like tints? Would you add something like a blue or a green to avoid the flat color to give variations and so on? What do you mean play with color, I guess?
So it's always going to be a situational based thing. So, like, you can always add some sort of tint to a grey, so to speak, but you can always add other colors that might not even like stereotypically be in there. Like rocks are never just grey or brown or whatever they are. There's always some sort of maybe hints of blue or purple, like especially cool, like really cool grey rocks. If you were to pick like a color pick from any point on a
Mm-hmm.
picture of something like that, it would probably show up as fairly blue,
Yeah.
which is something you can always work in, or you can go like really like saturated and go ham on it. It's stylized. It doesn't have to look real. It just needs to look enough what you're trying to make it look like to be recognizable.
Okay. So I guess experimentation again, just trying things out and seeing how they look and feel.
Essentially, yeah.
Can be
Like
useful. Yeah.
m- most of the for one of my projects, my Paladin's fan art piece, in the wood grain or in the wood sections of that piece, there's a lot of not just browns, but because I it's on that sort of warm spectrum, warm hue color range, I added in purples and reds and oranges and anything that would give it nice color variation and nice shadow colors
Mm-hmm.
that still looked like it not necessarily belonged, but it didn't have that stark difference.
Yeah.
But there's also nothing wrong with that. But that's just what I was going for at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of where you can have a play around with that as well. It's I know it's a bit of a vague answer.
No, no, it's hard. It's hard to give specifics on sort of stuff like that. Like it's experiment and sort of see what works. I totally get you. Yeah, yeah. I guess we could add in potentially like what you said before. I think is really important. Like look at your shadows and like your edge highlights. Like using your curvature and doing something interesting there can be helpful.
Yeah,
Just
most definitely.
yeah, to make things look kind of cool as well. Maybe that's something you could look at, Paulina. And final question, I think, from Daniel: is there any method that you use to control the ideas that you have for your stylized work without being overwhelmed? So you mentioned about like no right and wrong, and sometimes it's like you have so many ideas. It's like how do you filter that? How do you control, like where to take things? When do you stop? I guess that kind of thing.
Uh, for me, write it down.
Okay.
Write it all down. Like I will I'll quickly bring up something.
Hmm.
So this is where I do my sort of thinking, etc. This is just all the different stuff that I've got. Like in here as well, all the different stuff. But
Hmm.
in here is everything to do with that project that I might want.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of just little extra things. I use Mirror a lot for this as well. I will just sit there for ages and I'll just type. I'll just type everything out. And once I've got everything out, I then filter from there.
Right.
So get everything out of your head first and then start either culling or filtering or at least question mark.
Yeah.
Question mark is still it's still good. It still means that you're thinking about whether you do this or you go down this route. If it doesn't work, then I've got a backup method, or I don't like that anymore, get rid of it, not doing that, and we go with this. Just write it all down, get it out of your head,
Hmm.
however you do it, and see it all in one go.
Cool, cool, cool. There's one more question which has just popped up, if that's okay with Sam.
Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
so Sam asks, with so many ways to do stylized art, do you have a process or method to define the style you're going for with a specific piece? So with so many options available to you in terms of how you approach stylized art, do you have any way to sort of guide yourself to adhering to a certain style for the piece that you're working on?
I
These are
think I go
difficult questions.
Yeah, they're good. It's
They're
good.
good questions, but they're difficult questions.
They're great questions.
Yeah.
I think I go project by project mainly.
Hmm.
So from my last project, I will pick one to maybe max of three different things
Hmm.
that I either want to try in my next project or that I didn't try in this project that I want to try differently next time.
Right.
And I will make sure I don't stray too far from that because again it just balloons from there and once you start ballooning it's very hard to stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's the same sort of thing of when you're trying a new project and a lot of people will give you like don't try to do too many things in the one project because you'll never be able to do them.
Hmm.
So
So,
yeah, I basically pick two to three major changes,
yeah.
at least that will be major from like my last project or something that I haven't done yet,
Yeah.
and I will work on it in a particular project, whatever that might be. If it doesn't work for that project, then pick something else. Like,
Okay. So I guess just controlling your scope and keeping yourself like focused on, certain, don't overwhelm yourself with so many different options per project.
yeah, exactly. And it's the same thing again of just getting it all out of your head. Like if
Yeah.
I can keep those two to three max changes and I
Hmm.
have them written down or I have like a visual note of it, then I
Hmm.
can be like, that's what I'm going for. Like just reference it every time. Like that's the target. That's what I want to hit.
Awesome. Nikkita, this has been super, super useful. Alex has posted Nikkita's socials in the chat channel just at 1722. So you can find Nikkita's art station and her Twitter on there. If you're not following Nikkita, I would highly suggest that you do so. An amazing artist, some really, really cool stuff on her portfolio as well. Well worth checking out. I think that oven is still one of my favorite stylized pieces ever. Such a cool, cool concept. But yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time and speaking to everybody this evening and getting up at ridiculous o'clock. I think it's like 5:40 a.m. Is that right?
Close. We're 440.
4:40 a.m. Wow. Okay,
It's
so
fine.
that's crazy. So
It's
I
no
really
problem.
appreciate you taking the time to do that out of your weekend. It's very, very helpful for lots of people, particularly these students that are trying to get into stylized as their pathway. So very, very useful and appreciated, Nikkita. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was really cool. If any of you have any more questions or anything, feel free to message me. I will get to it as soon as I see it, considering I'm on a much different time zone than most people. But yeah, if you have anything you want to chat about at all, feel free to message me at any time.
That's awesome. I definitely have some students that will be reaching out to speak with you, so I really appreciate that as well. So yeah, thank you everyone for turning out. Hopefully you found that useful. I know I certainly did in terms of the insight. There'll be no workshop this Tuesday coming, so this workshop today was kind of in place of a Tuesday workshop. So we'll be back in just over a week with in March with another workshop, but none this week coming. I hope everyone has a really cool weekend for what remains of it, whatever you're getting up to. I think a few of us are going to do some gaming on XYZ tonight. But whatever you're doing, I hope you have a good one, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you very much.